Why have a workshop? Dan Barden asks that question in his essay called Workshop, a rant against creative writing classes. And Dan Barden ultimately concludes that the workshop isn't necessarily an arena in which one develops talent as a creative writer, so much as an area that teaches the value of failure, the value of desire, and the value of terror. Well, I want to talk about failure for a minute. I've been writing a very long time. You're much younger than I, but probably some of you have been writing for several years, maybe more. And we often, as writers, talk about the idea of inspiration. We might talk about flow, being in the zone, being in the groove. Those times when the words just seem to come naturally as we breathe, as naturally as a stone falls if tossed from a cliff, effortlessly. Well, I find that when I'm writing this way, and it does happen sometimes when the words are coming very easily, usually this writing is not very good. Why? Because when I'm writing in the groove, when the words are coming easily, I'm not testing myself. I'm not pushing myself. I'm using words, I'm using ideas that have long been in my brain. And in some ways, I'm simply going through the motions of repeating what is already well known in my head. However, those times when I'm writing and every new word as I try to move forward in the sentence is a mighty struggle. When I feel as if I suddenly am unable to read anymore, when I feel as if I'm unable to speak anymore, those are the times when I often make a breakthrough, or at the very least, write something fresh, interesting. So there's a real sense that creative writing, by definition, is an act of failure. In order to create, in order to push yourself into new territories of understanding, in order to come up with new ways to name old experiences, or in order to come up with new experiences that you might try to name with the habitual language. In order to do this, you must, in a very real way, fail. In other words, you must reach a point where your traditional, well worn ways of seeing and naming no longer work. When those no longer work, maybe just for a short time, you're forced to push yourself out into the new territory. That's the personal level. But even think on the level of language in general. What's one difference between literary language and non literary language? Non literary language is simply a tool for communication. You see it in journalism, you see it in op ed pieces. You are experiencing it right now. But literary language, by contrast, is language that isn't necessarily there to communicate. It's more there to stimulate. It's more there to shock, to stun, to alter, to turn. And for that reason, language as a tool in the creative writing piece, in a very real way, must break. It must fail. And if you think about some of the primary literary tropes and figures, in a way, this is a failure of language, language seen only as a tool for communication. Paradox, pun, irony, ambiguity. These are all ways to talk about literary language as a kind of language that fails to communicate a clear meaning in a clear way. And that breakage is the place where the strangeness, the unfamiliarity will erupt from the literary piece. So as we move through this class, I want us to think about the role of failure personally as we write our own pieces, but also just in terms of literary language in general. So that's one part of Barden's essay. The workshop is a place for cultivating failure, for valuing failure. He also says that the workshop should be a place to cultivate desire. What is it that makes for greatness? He talks about Michael Jordan. How many shots did Michael Jordan have to shoot? How many free throws did he have to shoot before he became great? 100, 200, 1,000, tens of thousands? It's not that Michael Jordan simply was born the greatest player. Because of his desire to be the best, he became the best. Barden also mentions Marilyn Monroe. One of her colleagues said of her, it wasn't that she was the most talented or the most beautiful of actresses. She simply wanted fame more. So desire is another way of talking about hard work. If you are a writer, what do? You are writing. You should write every day. You should write every time you have a chance to write. You should get yourself a notebook. Don't care what kind it is. Keep it with you at all times if possible, and write down whatever comes into your head or whatever you find interesting or strange. Write it down. Randall Jarrell, a famous poet, said this. I'm going to read it because it's one of my favorite quotes. A good poet is someone who manages, in a lifetime of standing out in thunderstorms, to be struck by lightning 5 or 6 times. A dozen or 24 times, and he is great. So, if you're going to be a great writer, you got to be willing to stand out in the storm. And if you stand out in the storm enough times, you might get struck by lightning. You might be hit by that jolt of energy that can create the powerful language. So, failure, desire, terror. Well, that's a pretty big word, and it might be a hyperbolic word. I doubt we'll feel much terror in our workshop. But if you think about it, to put yourself in the position of a writer who's open to having what he thinks is his very best writing be seen as a failure, and who knows that no matter how hard he or she tries, that's probably ultimately not good enough. There's constant striving, constant work. You never really get to where you end. There is a kind of terror there. If you see your role as a writer to create polished, overly well-structured, overly elegant, boring writing. If you see it as your role as a writer, fine. But if you see your role as a writer as to push against that safeness, there's a kind of existential terror there. And also, if you realize that you're never going to reach perfection, you will always be striving. You can always revise a piece, no matter what stage it is in. There's a kind of terror there too. But this is good. In some ways, the Creative Writing Workshop pushes against the boredom, the flatness, the predictability that is often our lives. And even that there, pushing against the stasis that we often use to organize our existence, pushing against that alone makes the workshop a very exciting, exhilarating place. I look forward to our speaking to one another about our writing.